The girl was born into a small African village where every sound of the drum carried meaning and every movement of the body told a story deeper than words. From the earliest days of her childhood, she seemed to belong to the rhythm of the earth itself. While other children played and stumbled, she would sway with the rustle of the leaves, her bare feet finding patterns in the dust that seemed to echo the heartbeat of the land. Her elders often said she did not learn dance, but that dance lived inside her, flowing from her spirit into her limbs as naturally as the river curved through the fields. By the time she was a young woman, she had become known throughout the village for her grace. Whenever she moved, silence would fall, and even those hardened by life's struggles would feel a moment of release watching her body weave through the air like a bird gliding against the wind. Her beauty was undeniable, yet it was not the softness of her face or the brightness of her eyes that captured people. It was the way she embodied freedom itself. Every step she took seemed to whisper of resistance against chains that life often placed on people's shoulders. Women burdened with labor saw hope in her movements, a reminder that they too could carry dignity despite their struggles. Children followed her in imitation, laughing and mimicking her spins, their tiny voices echoing her laughter as though they too could share in her lightness. Even men who prided themselves on strength lowered their pride for a moment when she danced, recognizing a different kind of power, one born not from muscle or weapons but from spirit. The village, however, was not without shadows. There were those who believed that too much freedom in a woman was dangerous. They whispered that her dancing was a challenge to traditions, that the way she drew attention with no shame in her joy might inspire others to rebel against the rigid roles assigned to them. But the girl never stopped. She danced at dawn when the first light stretched across the grasslands, and she danced in the evenings when the fire crackled and the elders told stories. To her, dancing was more than art, it was breath, prayer, and defiance. When she moved, she carried with her stories of her ancestors. Her steps mirrored the struggles of women before her, those who had been silenced but whose spirits still rose with the wind. Each sway of her hips was a reminder of survival, each twist of her arms a declaration that no matter the weight of hardship, the soul could not be broken. She was still young, barely past her teenage years, yet the wisdom she carried through her dance surpassed her age. Some said she had been touched by the spirits of the land, that the soil itself had chosen her as a vessel to remind the village that strength could exist in softness, and that freedom could be claimed even without words. Her presence was a contradiction to those who tried to control the rhythm of life. She was neither loud nor forceful. Her rebellion was in her quiet persistence, in the way she refused to let her joy be dimmed. When she danced in the open space of the village, the air itself seemed to bend around her, carrying her movements outward until it reached even the coldest hearts. Those who feared change tried to look away, but something about her grace was undeniable. It was as though the more they resisted, the more powerful her presence became. The girl did not yet know that her dance would one day test the might of swords and defy cruelty itself. For now, she simply moved because she had to, because stillness would suffocate her spirit. The rhythm inside her was too strong, and so she let it flow, turning herself into the living embodiment of freedom and strength. This was how her story began, not with war or conflict, but with a girl who dared to dance as if nothing could bind her, and in doing so reminded her people that the body could be a voice, and the soul could be unshackled even in silence. Whispers began to weave their way through the village, soft at first, like the breeze that rustled the leaves, but growing stronger with each passing moon. The young girl's gift had not gone unnoticed. Every time her feet touched the earth, it seemed as though she awakened something dormant within the land itself. People gathered not just to see her, but to feel the strange, liberating power that radiated from her steps. Some saw her as a blessing, a symbol of life and renewal. Yet, where there is admiration, envy often lurks close behind. Among the rival dancers in the village, resentment began to fester. For years they had trained with aching muscles and weary hearts, hoping to earn a sliver of recognition. But when she danced, it was as if effort itself melted into insignificance. Her movements were not crafted by endless repetition. They were born of something deeper, something untouchable. The rivals smiled to her face, but behind closed doors, they muttered about how unfair it was, how she had stolen the spotlight they believed belonged to them. Their envy grew sharper each time her name was spoken with awe. It wasn't only dancers who felt the sting of comparison. Some relatives, distant cousins and kin who once prided themselves on their place in the community, began to shrink in her shadow. Where they had once been praised for their looks, their songs, or their clever words, now all eyes turned toward her grace. "She thinks she's better than us," they whispered, twisting her innocence into arrogance. Every nod of admiration she received became, in their eyes, an insult to them. Jealousy thickened their voices, and bitterness made them eager to see her falter. And then there was the stepmother. She had watched the girl grow from afar at first, uninterested, dismissive even. But as the girl's beauty blossomed and her talent drew hearts toward her, something stirred in the woman's chest, a sharp, burning fear. The stepmother was not only threatened by the girl's gift, but by the attention it brought. Her husband spoke proudly of the child, the villagers came bearing praise, and suddenly the stepmother felt as though her own place in the household was crumbling. The girl was young, radiant, and beloved, while the woman felt herself slipping into the background, her presence shrinking as the girl's spirit shone brighter. The stepmother's jealousy was not a passing thing. It was a deep, coiling root that wound itself tighter each day. She began to watch the girl not with affection, but with calculation, studying her every move. Where others saw beauty, she saw a rival. Where others saw freedom, she saw a threat. Her mind twisted the girl's gift into a weapon pointed at her own heart. And in that warped vision, she convinced herself that the only way to regain her place, to silence the girl's radiance, was to break her. Even the men in the village were not free from envy. Some saw the admiration she drew as a challenge to their authority, a reminder that a young girl could command more respect with her bare feet than they could with their strength. Pride too has fragile roots, and hers unsettled them. They muttered that her gift was unnatural, that no woman should hold such power, that her dancing was more curse than blessing. What they feared, they disguised as disdain, and what they could not control, they longed to destroy. So the murmurs grew, feeding each other, until envy became a storm gathering on the horizon. What began as admiration had soured into resentment, and what should have been joy turned into a target for malice. She was still the same girl, her heart pure, her movements untainted. But in the eyes of those consumed by envy, she became something else entirely, a symbol of their inadequacy, a mirror reflecting their failures. And so, the roots of envy spread beneath the surface, unseen but unstoppable, waiting for the moment they would erupt into cruelty. They whispered in corners where shadows swallowed their words, weaving venom into every syllable. The girl had become more than just a dancer to the village. She was a light that rose above envy, a flame that burned too brightly for some to endure. Her gift carried her beyond the bounds of ordinary life, and those who watched her with bitter hearts convinced themselves that her freedom was an insult to their own chains. Jealousy is rarely loud at first. It begins as a quiet gnawing, the small discontent of watching someone move where you stumble, shine where you fade. But in time, it sharpens, it festers, and it demands action. It was her stepmother who first gave voice to the darkness. "She must be brought low," she whispered to a group of women whose daughters once tried to rival the girl on festival days. Those daughters had faltered beside her, unable to match the fluidity of her steps, and the mothers carried their humiliation like stones in their throats. The stepmother, veiling her hatred with a mask of concern, insisted the girl's talent was unnatural, dangerous even. "No one should move like that," she hissed, "unless something dark carries her feet." The women, already sharpened by envy, did not resist such reasoning. From the men came another echo of malice. There were warriors who had once basked in the admiration of the village, their strength unquestioned, their victories celebrated. Yet whenever the girl danced, all eyes turned away from their swords to her steps. She wielded no blade, wore no armor, yet she commanded a power that even warriors could not imitate, the power of beauty, of spirit, of unchained motion. For men who measured worth in broken shields and blood, her triumph in mere movement was intolerable. A girl should not outshine men of war, one spat, bitterness seeping through his teeth. The plot grew slowly like vines twisting around a tree. At first they tried softer cruelties, denying her food, forcing her into exhausting labor, hoping her body would betray her. But each evening, no matter how weary her hands or how empty her stomach, her feet found rhythm. She danced under the moon when the village slept, and though her body trembled with fatigue, her spirit rose higher than ever. Instead of dimming her, hardship polished her like stone in a river's current. This resilience only deepened the conspirators' rage. Finally, one of the warriors spoke the thought aloud that had lingered in their dark hearts. "Her power is in her feet. Break them and she will never dance again." His words fell like a curse among the gathered, and silence stretched before reluctant agreement settled in. It was cruel, yes, but to them cruelty had already become necessity. If she could no longer dance, the spell she cast over the village would shatter. No one would remember her as a flame, only as a crippled girl whose light had been extinguished. The stepmother seized the plan with eager claws. She would be the one to lure the girl, weaving lies about chores or errands, guiding her to where the warriors waited. The others promised secrecy, swearing that the act would not be seen as malice but as fate. When she falls, they told one another, the village will forget her. But they did not speak of the shadow of guilt that lurked at the edges of their resolve. And so the conspiracy hardened. What began as whispers of envy crystallized into a plan of violence. They imagined her cries, her helplessness, her broken form. They imagined the silence of her dances ending forever. What they did not imagine, what they could not imagine, was that her spirit, forged in freedom and fire, would not be broken by shattered bones. They had convinced themselves that feet carried her strength. They did not understand that her soul had already learned to dance in ways no sword could destroy. The night of their decision closed with a terrible stillness. In the hearts of the conspirators, excitement mingled with dread. They told themselves it was only justice, only balance. But deep down they knew envy was driving their hands, and that in trying to silence her, they were raising their weapons against something greater than flesh and bone. They waited for the night when the moon was pale and thin, when the wind bent the tall grasses but carried no sound to warn the girl. In secret, they gathered near the edge of the clearing, those who had long nursed their envy until it had grown into something sharper than any blade. Among them were rival dancers who could never match her grace, women who despised the way the village children adored her, and even elders who feared her presence might one day eclipse their authority. They spoke in low voices, deciding that only by destroying the source of her beauty, her feet, could they end the light she carried within her. They believed that if her steps were broken, her spirit would falter, her joy would vanish, and the village would forget her. It was not only cruelty, it was desperation to erase her gift. The conspirators prepared tools of harm with ritual precision. Swords were sharpened until their edges gleamed faintly in the starlight. Ropes were twisted, rough and biting, to bind her legs and prevent her escape. Some even whispered prayers to dark spirits, asking for strength to carry out the deed, believing that only a force beyond human pity could allow them to strike at someone so radiant. The atmosphere of their plotting was thick with both fear and excitement, a twisted bond that kept them together. They convinced themselves that what they were doing was justice, that no single girl should hold so much power in the sway of her steps. When the night deepened, they moved like shadows through the village, their footsteps muffled, their breaths sharp. They found her near her family's hut, where she sat weaving strands of grass into bracelets for the younger children. The conspirators encircled her, their eyes glinting with malice, and before she could rise, they pounced. The ropes were thrown around her wrists and ankles, tightening with every pull. She struggled, her face a mixture of fear and defiance, but the cords cut into her skin and held her fast. Some pressed her to the ground, while others raised their weapons, determined to carry out the deed that had haunted their whispers for weeks. The first sword hovered over her foot, its point trembling in the uncertain grip of a conspirator. For a moment hesitation flickered in the air. The girl looked at him with wide, unblinking eyes, and something in that gaze almost broke his will. But the others shouted, urging him on, their jealousy boiling into cruel demands. The rope was pulled tighter, forcing her legs still, and the blade lowered again. Each moment stretched long, filled with the crackling silence of malice ready to be unleashed. They began their cruelty slowly, pressing the edge of the weapon against her skin, leaving thin marks that stung with pain. Another conspirator, unwilling to wait, seized a heavy stone and brought it down near her toes, missing only because she twisted at the last moment. They cursed her movements and bound her tighter, one wrapping the rope so cruelly that blood welled where it cut. Their frenzy grew with every failed strike, as though the very act of her resisting made their hatred burn hotter. Some chanted fragments of a ritual, calling on shadows to weaken her, to rob her of the strength to fight. The night became a blur of violence and rage. Her cries were muffled by a cloth forced into her mouth, her tears soaking into the dust beneath her cheek. Still her spirit did not collapse. Every time a blade fell short, every time a rope slipped, every time a stone missed, there was a spark of defiance in her eyes, as if she carried an unseen shield around her. The conspirators grew more desperate, striking harder, pulling tighter, until their breaths came ragged and their arms ached. Yet for all their fury they could not bring the final blow. Her feet, though bruised and bleeding, would not break. By the time dawn's first light touched the horizon, the conspirators were exhausted. Their weapons were stained, their hands trembling, but their victory had not come. They looked upon her, bound, battered, yet unbroken, and felt something colder than failure seep into their bones. For in her suffering she still shone. The strength they sought to silence only grew louder in her silence, and though they left her wounded, they carried with them the dreadful realization that they had not destroyed her gift, but only revealed its depth. Would you like me to carry this into the aftermath scene, where the village reacts to seeing her wounds and resilience, in the next section, or should I hold that until your next outline point? The conspirators believed the girl's spirit would break the moment her body was wounded. They believed that if her feet, the very instruments of her gift, were destroyed, she would collapse in agony and never again find joy in movement. So when their cruel attempts failed to crush her completely, when the ropes loosened and the swords dulled without explanation, they expected at least to see her crawl away weeping, too wounded to resist further torment. But what they did not know was that something deeper than flesh had been awakened within her. As she stood barefoot upon the hard earth, her ankles still sore from the ropes that had cut into them, something rippled through her body. It was not fear. It was not despair. It was rhythm. A pulse beneath the soil, as though the ground itself hummed in recognition of her suffering. She felt her feet move almost of their own accord, pressing against the earth not in weakness but in challenge. The conspirators, standing with swords still in their hands, froze as she lifted her head and her eyes glowed with a light they could not name. Her first step was slow, a dragging brush across the dust. Her second was firmer, a deliberate stamp, as though to remind the world she was not broken. And then, like a flame catching wind, her movements quickened. She began to spin, her arms outstretched, her hair whipping around her face. What should have been trembling became grace. What should have been pain became music. The villagers who had gathered to watch, some in pity, others in cruel delight, fell into stunned silence. The ground beneath her seemed to respond with every movement. Each stamp of her feet sent a faint tremor through the soil, as though the earth itself kept rhythm with her. The conspirators, gripping their weapons, felt the vibration climb up their arms, shaking the confidence from their grip. She twirled once more, and when her bare foot brushed against the sword of the nearest man, the blade rang like a drum and snapped cleanly in two. Gasps rose from the crowd. The conspirators looked at one another, their eyes wide with disbelief. "It is a trick," one muttered, but his voice shook. "She hides her pain with illusions." But there was no illusion. With every beat, her dance grew stronger, more radiant. She bent low and rose high, her movements flowing like water one moment and striking like lightning the next. The dust around her lifted into swirls, catching the sunlight and making her figure glow as though she were wrapped in fire. Each turn of her body sent sparks of energy rippling into the air. The villagers, who only moments before had doubted her, began to murmur among themselves. Some pressed their hands to their hearts, feeling the rhythm echo inside them. Others swore they saw shadows of ancestors moving behind her, spirits who had once danced in forgotten rituals. It was no longer just her dance, it was the dance of generations, the dance of endurance, the dance of defiance. Another conspirator raised his sword and lunged toward her, determined to end the spectacle. But before the blade could strike, she leapt into the air, spinning in a spiral that no ordinary body could perform. Her foot met the steel with a sharp crack and once again the weapon shattered, scattering into useless fragments. The crowd gasped louder this time, not in horror but in awe. Her enemies faltered. "She cannot be human," one whispered, his face pale. But she was human, human and more. Her pain had not destroyed her. It had revealed her truth. She was not simply a girl who danced for beauty or applause. She was a vessel of something greater, the spirit of resilience that cannot be bound, cannot be cut, cannot be silenced. Her dance carried her closer to her stepmother, who had stood smirking in the shadows, certain that this plot would rid her of her rival once and for all. Now the stepmother's smirk melted into fear as the girl's glowing figure approached. The girl did not speak a word, she did not need to. The rhythm of her feet spoke louder than any accusation. It said, "You tried to break me, but I will rise higher than you imagined." The stepmother stumbled back, tripping over her own garments as though the very earth rejected her presence. Others who had conspired looked away, ashamed, as though the girl's brilliance exposed the ugliness in their hearts. The dance reached its height. Faster and faster she spun, her movements no longer bound by human limits. Her bare feet struck sparks from the soil, and her arms carved shapes in the air like blazing patterns. The villagers began to clap in rhythm, drawn into her defiance. What had begun as a display of cruelty was transformed into a celebration of power. Finally, as the sun dipped low and the dust settled, she slowed. Her last step was a gentle press into the earth, and the vibration carried far, like a heartbeat felt across the land. She stood tall, unbowed, her chest rising with steady breath. Her feet, unbroken and radiant, bore no trace of the violence inflicted on them. Silence held for a moment before the crowd erupted, not in laughter or mockery but in cries of admiration. They called her blessed, untouchable, a child of the ancestors. Some fell to their knees, while others sang praises, their voices joining the echo of her dance. Her conspirators, meanwhile, dropped their broken swords and fled into the shadows, terrified not only of her strength but of the justice they felt would surely follow. For they had tried to break her, but in doing so, they had awakened something indestructible. And she, standing tall in the center of the square, knew her battle was far from over. Yet in that moment, with her feet humming against the earth, she realized the truth. No sword could silence her spirit and no chain could bind her rhythm. Her dance would always rise. The night of her defiance had not ended when the conspirators realized their cruelty had failed. Whispers spread through the village like dry leaves carried by the wind. Asterisk, her feet had not broken. Asterisk, the ropes, the rituals, the sharp instruments meant to silence her spirit had failed. And now the enemies grew desperate. Their wounded pride demanded a new trial, one darker and more brutal than before. "We will not allow her to rise above us," the leader snarled, pacing inside a shadowed hut lit by oil lamps. "If ropes cannot hold her and chance cannot curse her, then iron will. Swords shall silence her steps forever." A murmur of agreement followed. Warriors unsheathed their blades, testing their edges against the firelight. The conspirators believed that even if her spirit was untouchable, her flesh was not. They convinced themselves that the cold steel of forged iron would succeed where rituals had failed. When dawn came, the village awoke to the unsettling clamor of steel clashing in practice. Men sharpened swords, sparks flying as they prepared for the spectacle. The girl, however, was not afraid. She stood quietly outside her small hut, her face calm, her hair loose around her shoulders. She did not speak of vengeance nor of fear, only of dance. Her friends begged her to flee into the forest, to escape the cruelty awaiting her. But she shook her head. "If I run, they will only chase me. If I hide, they will only dig deeper to find me. But if I stand before them, the truth will show itself. And the truth is stronger than any sword." The day of confrontation arrived. The conspirators gathered the village into the clearing, declaring loudly, "Today the girl's false power will be broken. No step of hers shall mock us again." Warriors circled her, each blade gleaming like a shard of sunlight. The crowd's breath hung heavy in the air. Some villagers wept quietly, fearing the cruelty that was about to unfold. Yet others leaned forward with curiosity, wondering if the girl's strange gift would again resist destruction. The girl stepped into the center of the circle. Her bare feet touched the earth gently as if greeting an old friend. She closed her eyes, inhaling deeply, and when the first sword swung toward her ankles, she moved. Her dance began slowly, a rhythm of grace and defiance. Each step was deliberate, each gesture fluid. As the blade descended, her foot slid across the earth with such speed that the steel met the ground instead. The sword clanged against stone, cracking its edge. Gasps rose from the crowd. A second warrior lunged, blade aimed at her heel. The girl leapt, spinning midair, and when her feet touched the ground again, the force of her landing sent vibrations across the earth. The sword that tried to strike her trembled, and with a sharp snap, its blade split into two jagged pieces. The conspirators watched in disbelief. The more the warriors attacked, the stronger her dance became. The circle that was meant to confine her now seemed like her stage. Her feet were no longer flesh and bone, they were vessels of unshakable energy, pulsing with an unseen rhythm that broke every weapon daring to touch her. One after another, the warriors lunged. Each swing was met not with screams but with movement. She spun, she leapt, she bent, and she rose again. And every time steel sought to pierce her, it shattered instead, splitting down the middle, crumbling into fragments, or flying from the warrior's trembling hands. The villagers stared in awe. Dust rose around her, swirling like a cloak as if even the earth wished to shield her. The rhythm of her dance merged with the clang of breaking swords, creating a sound unlike anything they had ever heard. Music born from defiance, destruction, and survival. By the time the 10th warrior's sword shattered, silence fell over the clearing. All that remained were fragments of broken steel scattered across the ground like fallen leaves. The conspirators, pale and shaken, could no longer deny what they had seen. This cannot be," one whispered, his voice trembling. "No flesh resists iron." But the villagers had already begun to murmur a different truth. "It is not flesh that resists, it is her spirit. Her spirit is stronger than iron." The girl stood at the center, her chest rising and falling with steady breaths. She had not spoken a word, yet her body had told a story louder than voices could carry. Her dance was not just survival, it was defiance. It was a declaration that cruelty, no matter how sharp its weapon, could never cut the thread of a soul destined to rise. As the conspirators retreated into their shame, the people of the village began to cheer softly, their voices swelling like waves. Children clapped their hands to mimic her steps. Women raised their voices in song. Men who had once doubted her now bowed their heads in reverence. The girl, however, did not bask in victory. She simply looked down at her unbroken feet and whispered a prayer of gratitude to the earth beneath her. For she knew the clash with swords was not just about her. It was about every soul in the village who had ever been told to bow, to break, to silence their truth. And now, because of her dance, they all knew that even steel could be defeated when faced with the spirit of freedom. The sound of swords clashing against the earth had already begun to spread like wildfire through the village. From every corner, market stalls, riverbanks, distant fields, people hurried toward the square where the confrontation was unfolding. Mothers clutched their children's hands, pulling them close, while elders leaned on their carved sticks, curiosity and unease written across their weathered faces. The young men who had once doubted her power ran ahead, desperate to see whether the rumors were true. When the villagers arrived, they found her in the center of it all, her feet moving with a rhythm that belonged neither to drum nor song but to something older, something unshakable. Around her, broken swords littered the dust, their edges twisted like vines scorched by lightning. The enemy stood in confusion, gripping what remained of their weapons, their eyes wild with disbelief. Every attempt to strike her had only ended in their humiliation, for their steel had shattered before her flesh could be touched. At first, the crowd whispered among themselves, uncertain of what they were witnessing. Was this witchcraft? Was this the blessing of the ancestors? Or had the spirits themselves descended to protect her? But as she moved, the whispers quieted, replaced by a silence so heavy it pressed into their bones. Her dance was not frantic or fearful. It was poised, deliberate, as though each step she took was meant to inscribe truth into the earth itself. Her garments flowed with her movements, and her eyes glowed with calm defiance, unshaken by the chaos surrounding her. One elder, his voice cracked with age, leaned toward the others and whispered, "No mortal girl moves this way. Her feet are bound by something greater. The earth itself guards her." His words rippled through the gathering, giving shape to the awe already rising in their chests. The conspirators, though shaken, grew desperate. They tightened their circle, swords raised high, their pride refusing to yield before the eyes of so many witnesses. With a shout, they lunged at her together, hoping that the combined strength of their steel would finally break her spirit. But as the blades descended, her body swayed, and her feet stamped once against the ground. A crack like thunder roared through the square, and before everyone's eyes the swords snapped midair, their pieces scattering like brittle sticks. Gasps tore through the villagers. Children clung tighter to their mothers. A woman fell to her knees, trembling, and pressed her forehead to the dust as though she had seen the hand of a god. The enemies staggered back, staring at the hilts in their hands that now held nothing but jagged, useless shards. Their strength, their weapons, their pride, everything had failed them. Still she continued to dance. Not once did her expression harden with vengeance, nor did she raise her voice in mockery. She needed no words, for her movement spoke louder than any declaration. With each turn and step it became clear, she was not merely surviving their cruelty, she was transforming it. What was meant to shatter her was being broken instead. What was meant to silence her had only magnified her presence. The circle of witnesses began to shift. Fear gave way to reverence. Men and women who had once ignored her now stepped closer, compelled as if drawn by the rhythm of her spirit. Some began to clap softly, timidly at first, then louder as courage grew among them. Others began to chant her name, their voices weaving with her dance until the entire square pulsed with a power far greater than the enemies could ever summon. The conspirators looked around in horror, realizing too late that their plan had failed not only against her feet but also against the hearts of the people. What was once a private attempt to destroy her had turned into a public revelation of her strength. Every villager present had seen the truth with their own eyes. No sword could touch her, no cruelty could bind her. She was not fragile, she was untouchable. One young boy, his voice cutting through the chants, cried out, "She dances for all of us." The words caught fire in the air, and soon others repeated them, until the whole crowd roared in agreement. She dances for all of us. Her struggle was no longer hers alone, it belonged to them, to their memory, to their future. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the village, the enemies dropped what remained of their weapons. Their hands shook with rage and shame, but they could not silence the truth. The people had witnessed the breaking of swords, the breaking of pride, and the rise of a girl whose strength was beyond the reach of cruelty. That day the circle of witnesses became more than bystanders. They became guardians of her story, bearers of the truth that her feet could not be broken, and that unseen forces walked with her. And as she finished her final turn, her body still glowing with unearthly grace, the villagers knew this was not the end of her defiance. It was only the beginning of a legend that would be told for generations. The clash had lasted long enough that sweat dripped from the brows of those who raised their swords against her, yet the young woman stood in the center of the earth-beaten clearing, her feet never ceasing their rhythm. Each strike meant to cut her down had instead been met with a song of metal shattering, splintering into fragments that scattered across the soil. Now the conspirators' weapons lay broken, their pride scattered like the shards of their blades. At first they had believed her survival to be a trick of chance. One sword breaking might have been explained by a weak forging, another by bad timing. But when every weapon snapped, when every rope fell useless at her ankles, when every attempt to bind her feet dissolved into futility, doubt began to seed within their hearts. Their eyes darted to one another, searching for answers, finding only fear reflected back. Her dance had grown brighter, fiercer, almost luminous. Dust rose beneath her steps like smoke from a sacred fire. Each movement seemed guided by forces older than memory, forces that no cruelty could command. The rhythm of her feet spoke a truth they could no longer deny: she was not theirs to break. The crowd that had gathered earlier in suspicion now leaned closer in awe. Men who had muttered that her fate was sealed, women who had once lowered their eyes to avoid sharing her suffering, and children who had hidden behind their mothers' legs now watched with wide, unblinking gazes. Their whispers swelled into gasps, then silence, then a hum of wonder. The tale was already writing itself into their hearts. The conspirators, stripped of the confidence that had bound them together, tried to rally once more. One among them, the eldest and most cruel, spat into the dust and shouted, "She deceives you. She walks with tricks, not strength. Do not be fooled." But even as he spoke, his knees betrayed him. His strength, drained by failure, faltered. The broken hilt of his weapon slipped from his trembling grip. His cry, meant to rally, became a rasp that exposed his weakness to all. Others attempted to mimic courage. One ran to fetch another blade, only to watch it splinter before it touched her. Another tried to tie a rope around her, but the knot loosened as though the fibers themselves rejected the task. With each humiliation, the audience's belief shifted further away from the oppressors and into the girl who moved like a storm wrapped in grace. Her eyes never left them, not with hatred, not with cruelty, but with the calm certainty of one who knows she is guarded by something greater. Her movements carried no vengeance, only defiance. Yet the power of that defiance stripped her enemies bare. They had gathered their strength in numbers, in weapons, in rituals of cruelty designed to make her bend. And yet here she was, unbroken, while they stumbled and faltered like children who had forgotten how to stand. Their humiliation deepened when the villagers began to murmur, not in pity for her, but in disgust for them. "See how they falter before her dance," one whispered. "See how the swords refuse their commands." Others nodded, voices rising, until their condemnation grew louder than the conspirators' commands. The very people they had ruled through fear now turned against them. Fear no longer bound the crowd, wonder had replaced it. One by one the conspirators retreated. Their shoulders sagged, their pride shattered. The weight of eyes upon them, the eyes of those who once cowered, burned hotter than any sword. Their cruelty had been exposed not through bloodshed but through its own failure. They had meant to break a girl and prove their power. Instead they had proved their impotence. The young woman slowed her dance, though her feet never ceased moving. The dust settled in waves around her, like the breath of the earth sighing in relief. Silence hung heavy in the air, broken only by the rasping breaths of those who had tried to defeat her. They stood in a circle, no longer as hunters but as hunted, cornered not by weapons but by truth. Some fell to their knees, begging forgiveness not from her, but from the crowd that glared with newly lit fury. Others slunk away, hiding their faces, their once commanding voices reduced to stammers. A few still tried to mutter excuses, but their words rang hollow against the memory of blades snapping like dry twigs. The humiliation was complete. They had been undone not only before her, but before the eyes of all who would carry the tale. Their cruelty was no longer hidden in shadows. It had been dragged into the light and stripped of every mask. The girl finally ceased her dance, her final step as light as a whisper. She lifted her chin, her gaze sweeping across those who had sought her ruin. No words left her lips, for none were needed. Her survival, her unbroken movement, her radiant defiance had spoken louder than any tongue could. She stood unbowed, her silence heavier than their shouting, her calmness more powerful than their rage. The crowd surged closer, not to harm her but to bear witness. Children smiled through parted lips, elders nodded with solemn reverence, and women clasped their hands as though they had seen a vision of hope. The conspirators, by contrast, shrank in the presence of such recognition. Their names, once spoken with fear, now dripped with shame. The tale of their downfall had already begun to spread, carried on every whisper, etched into every heart. Where once they had ruled with cruelty, they now would walk in disgrace. Their authority had fractured like their swords, and the pieces would never be mended. Thus their defeat was sealed, not by her hand but by their own. Their failure, their exposure, their humiliation became the punishment they could not escape. For even as they staggered away, their shadows seemed smaller, their voices dimmer, while hers, through her dance, had grown vast enough to fill the earth. The household, once filled with whispers of disdain and mockery, now stood in stunned silence. Those who had laughed at her suffering, who had ridiculed her for walking barefoot, and who had mocked her gentle endurance, now found their tongues stilled by awe. The air was heavy with realization. They had been blind to the truth that had stood before them all along. She was no longer just the girl who had endured cruelty in silence. She was the girl who had danced upon swords, unbroken, radiant, and untouchable. Her dance had ended, not with collapse or pain, but with her standing tall, her breathing steady, her eyes lifted with quiet strength. Around her lay the evidence of a power greater than flesh and bone, swords shattered into fragments, the cruel hands that once held them trembling in defeat. The villagers who had gathered outside the gates were whispering now, not in scorn but in reverence. Her name began to slip from their lips in tones usually reserved for blessings or sacred songs. Inside the household, the transformation was immediate but uneasy. Her stepmother, whose heart had always carried a seed of envy, now felt that envy twist into fear. She had believed cruelty would break the girl, reducing her into nothing more than a shadow of despair. Yet the opposite had happened. Her cruelty had been the very furnace in which the girl's resilience had been forged. Where the stepmother had intended weakness, strength had emerged. Where she had hoped for silence, a dance that spoke louder than words filled the earth. Her stepsisters, who once delighted in her humiliation, now shrank back. Their eyes, wide with disbelief, could no longer meet hers. They had joined their mother in laughter when she was forced to walk barefoot on thorns, sneering at her quiet endurance, but now the memory of those moments burned them with shame. They had no swords to wield, no strength to claim, only guilt heavy on their hearts. The father of the house, long silent and swayed by the harshness of his new wife, could no longer avert his gaze. 4 years he had allowed injustice to reign under his roof, excusing his inaction with feeble words or distracted silence. Now, as he watched his daughter stand unbroken, he felt the weight of his failures press down upon him. This was not just his daughter's triumph, it was also his shame. Yet even as regret pierced him, he saw an opportunity for change, a chance to realign himself with the truth that had always been present. The villagers began to press into the household, no longer merely spectators but witnesses to a divine revelation. They did not see a fragile girl anymore, they saw a chosen one marked by forces unseen. Some murmured that the ancestors had risen to protect her, others whispered that the spirits of justice had wrapped her in their cloak. Whatever the explanation, it was clear she was not ordinary. Her dance had not only shattered swords, it had shattered the illusions of cruelty and superiority that had poisoned the home. The conspirators were dragged forward, their humiliation laid bare. The stepmother tried to speak, but her words faltered. For the first time she felt the collective judgment of the community weigh against her. The villagers' eyes, sharp with indignation, stripped away her masks of respectability and authority. No longer could she hide behind her position as wife or matron. She was seen for what she was, a woman who had tried to crush light with darkness, only to be consumed by her own shadows. The girl did not gloat, nor did she raise her voice in revenge. Her silence was louder than the cries of her enemies. Her calm presence forced all who looked at her to reflect upon themselves. The villagers, the father, even the servants who once joined in laughter, each now questioned where they stood in the scale of cruelty and compassion. In the days that followed, the transformation of the household deepened. The stepmother and her daughters found themselves isolated, stripped of their influence. Neighbors no longer visited them with courtesy. Instead, they spoke of them as a warning, a reminder of what happens when cruelty is allowed to fester unchecked. The father, shamed and awakened, turned his devotion toward his daughter, seeking forgiveness not with words but with changed actions. As for the girl, she did not dwell on vengeance. She carried herself with a dignity that baffled her enemies further. She tended to the home with the same grace as before, but now her presence commanded respect. When she walked through the village, people bowed their heads slightly, children gazed at her with wide eyes, and elders whispered blessings under their breath. She had become more than a daughter in a troubled household. She had become a living symbol of endurance, justice, and divine protection. The household that once mocked her had been turned into a place of reckoning. Every corner echoed with the memory of her dance. Every face reflected the weight of the lesson they had learned. The transformation was not merely in how they saw her, but in how they saw themselves. And in that transformation, justice had been served, not through punishment alone, but through the undeniable revelation of truth.